45 million. That's how often the board game Catan has been sold worldwide. And today, tens of thousands of people play it competitively online. Personally, I started playing when I was 10 years old. Since then, I won multiple tournaments, I got hired as a Catan coach, and I became the #1 player on Catan's most popular website. However, if I were to start all over with zero knowledge, what would I need to know? Well, that's what I'll share with you today. I'll be talking in depth about the best strategies, where to place the robber, and so much more. Everything you need to know, put together in a 10-chapter framework so it's easy to follow. The first chapter is easy, but it's crucial to understand to follow the later chapters. A game of Catan is won by the player who has 10 victory points on their own turn. And there's many ways to accomplish this. In this example, the winner has 3 cities, 1 settlement, the largest army, and 1 victory point from the development card deck as the 10th remaining point. Let's calculate the cost. It results in 13 ore, 12 wheat, 6 sheep, 4 wood and 4 brick, totaling 39 resources. So we can tell that you need a lot of ore and wheat if you plan on winning Catan this way. Of course, a game of Catan doesn't always run as smoothly. You will get stolen from, you will 7 out, for some purchases you have to trade with the bank, you don't draw the victory point in one try, and other players compete for the largest army as well. So conclusion, you need a lot of cards. Now let's take a look at how you can get the cards you want without your opponent getting in the way. A strategy is an intricate set of choices that positions you on a playing field in a way that you win. Examples of your choices are, should you go for Orv cheap, largest army or longest road? Should you buy a city before you play your development cards? Then the playing field is the board, the dice rolls, and the decisions your opponents make. If you pick the right strategy, you have a good shot at winning the game. The 6 most popular Catan strategies are as followed. The first, full Orv cheap, places on ore, wheat and sheep to buy development cards and build cities efficiently. Hybrid Orv cheap, on the other hand, adds a bit of wood or brick to this mix to be able to build a road and settlement more reliably. The city plus road setup builds on ore and wheat to build cities and on wood and brick to buy a lot of roads, forming a 10-point plan of 4 cities and the longest road. The road builder focuses more heavily on longest road and settlement expansion. They have a ton of wood and brick, combined with a little bit of the remaining resources. Port strategies have a lot of a specific resource and a matching 2-for-1 port. They're quite flexible. The last, but certainly not the least popular, is the 5 resource strategy. You simply get all 5 resources to spend your resources in the most efficient way. You can also combine these strategies, and I recommend you to do so. This is how the strategies position themselves. You have full Orv cheap and hybrid Orv cheap that specialize themselves for the largest army, while the road builder and the city plus road setups specialize themselves for the longest road. The 5 resource setup and the port strategies take advantage of the specialized setups having a slow start to the game, as they're set up in a way they can play for both the army or the road, but they are less well equipped to focus on them. However, if one of the specialized setups has a slow start, they can overtake them because the specialized setups still have to focus on production. Now let's focus how we can get these strategies in the first place. But first, I need you to know 3 things. The first is ore and wheat are the best resources. Second is put your settlements on good numbers like 8, 5, 6 and 9 because they roll more often. And the third is if a certain resource has bad numbers, so it means they're less likely to roll, and that means there will be more trade opportunities for these resources because everybody wants them. In first position, you want to predict what spots will be left for you when your second choice, the 8th settlement, comes around. So we take the best spots of the board. The 6, 5, 11, 5, 9, 10, 6, 9, 3, 8, 4, 10, 6, 3, 11, 8, 5, 10, 9, 10, 11, and 8, 4, 3. So that's already 8 spots, which means you'll be able to combine your top settlement with one of the weakest spots I highlighted. So let's pick a spot that works with all of them. If you select the 693, you could play full Orv cheap with these spots. You could also go for hybrid Orv cheap with these spots and a 5 resource strategy with the 843 at the top of the board. So first of all, Catan is an economic game. But what does that mean in practice? Well, it means there's things you can buy that give you ROI, so return on investment. Your investment is the resources you spend for, let's say, a settlement, so it costs you 4 resources. If you build it on a good enough spot early in the game, this settlement might yield you 10 more cards throughout the game. So 10 minus the 4 resources you spend buying the settlement gives you plus 6 resources. So you have a ROI of 6. Roads, on the other hand, only cost resources, but they don't give ROI, whereas development cards are a bit trickier to evaluate overall. However, in general, they do give ROI. Other key Catan principles are production and flexibility. Production refers to getting new resource cards through dice rolls, while flexibility are the options you create through the cards and tools you have. Let's see how we can optimize production first. The odds of rolling a 6 are 13.9% each turn. while the odds of rolling a 10 are 8.3%. So in general, you're better off settling on the 6 than the 10. So place your settlements and cities on spots that have better odds. But as you remember from chapter 2, simply putting your settlement on the highest producing spot and then calling it a day is not gonna get the job done. But to increase your spending flexibility, you do have a couple of tools. First is resource balance. If you're settled on a 10 ore, an 8 wheat and an 11 wheat, it's likely you'll produce much more wheat than ore. The building cost card teaches us that you need more ore than wheat when you plan to build a lot of cities. You can solve this by upgrading the spot on your 10 ore to a city to restore the resource balance. You can also solve it by building on a wheat port or a 3-for-1 port. Or perhaps there's a player in the game who doesn't produce any wheat but does produce a lot of ore. It's a good idea to trade with them. Number diversity is also important. If you build on an 8-4-3 twice, it's going to lead to many turns with no cards and some turns with 10 plus cards. You risk losing your cards to a 7 out more than when you diversify your numbers. An exception to this rule is when the same numbers are placed on resources that are typically spent together like wood brick and ore wheat. However, don't take a worse spot in the name of number diversity. To avoid getting blocked out of the game, there's a couple things you can do. The first is to buy development cards. Many beginner and intermediate players are afraid of getting blocked themselves, so they avoid blocking you. The second is having 2 hexes of your key resources, so ore and wheat, which makes it so that if one of them is blocked, you still have one of them open, which still produces resources for you. However, it also makes it so that your opponents find it a less strategic block, so they're less likely to block it for that reason. The third is to position your resources on triple shared hexes. A triple shared hex includes 3 players, so there's only one player who actually wants to put it there, while there's also 3 players that defend this spot with a knight, so it's very unlikely to be blocked for a very long time. Solo blocks don't happen as often in the early game, unless you have a considerable lead, so being the only player on a spot actually makes it less likely the spot is blocked. The biggest risks are actually double shared spots with good numbers on ore and wheat, but always keep in mind that each level of play has different tendencies and opportunities. You can split each game of Catan in 4 phases. The initial placements, the early game, the mid game and the end game. We've covered the initial placements already, so let's move on to the early game. The early game is all about improving your production and your spending flexibility. You also make a head start for the 2-point bonus in your 10-point plan. So either the largest army by buying development cards or the longest road by building roads in strategic positions. In the early game, wood and brick have increased value because building roads and settlements are most effective as some good spots are still available now. You also want to focus on your toughest task first. If you're playing ore cheap, it means building a road plus settlement to a relevant port. If you're playing wood brick, your toughest task is the city. And if you're a port player, you build on your important port first and then city up directly after. The early game ends when you have at least increased your production 1.5 times, you completed your toughest task, and you're no longer solely dependent on 4-for-1 trades in terms of spending flexibility. You also must be clear on your 10-point plan. Mid-game. At some point in the game, you'll notice that some players have a great start and some are falling behind. The player in the best position now needs to be blocked and stopped at all costs. While it can be advantageous for you to help the players with a weak start back into the game by accepting their trades more easily. The start of the mid game is a great strategic point for the generalist strategies, like port strategies and the 5 resource setup. If one of the specialist strategies is falling behind, it means there's an opportunity to take the 2-point bonus. So let's say the hybrid or cheap player has only built a road and 1 development card so far, then this is the moment to start buying development cards to win the largest army. Endgame. This last phase starts when one player is close to winning the game. I define close as within 10 cards of winning the game. For example, an opponent needs 1 city and 2 roads. So that would be 9 resources in the most efficient path. You also need to include the card your opponents hold in their hands in this calculation. You need to be aware of all opponents' situations to not be caught off guard with a surprise double play of an opponent taking longest road and the largest army in the same turn, for example. During the mid game, you want to keep a flexible end game. So some things to keep in mind are: how many settlement spots does everyone still have? What is my maximum road length and who's competing for it? Which development cards are left in the deck? And of course, how many victory points does everyone have? So how does that help with keeping a flexible endgame? Well, it's simple, because it reveals the path you have of winning the game yourself. In some situations you only have one path and then you're not quite flexible. However, if you have multiple paths, you have multiple threats, like your opponents have a problem when you build a road, but they also have a problem when you buy a development card, so they can't really stop you. Trading is essential. The best players in the game offer more than 30 trades per game, and while they don't take all of them, they realize that advancing the game is very important, even at the cost at advancing a game of someone else as well. well. The most important skill for trading is table awareness. You need to be able to follow many things at once, like who's leading, what resource and development cards does everyone have, who will build what next, how valuable is this resource, what are the odds of me and my opponent getting the resource we need, and many more things. You need to keep track of this every single turn, because each play changes the equation. And then comes the tough part, because you need to be able to make these decisions in a split second, because in most competitions, the first player who says yes gets the deal. And you could be missing out on a lot of trades if you don't make your decisions fast enough. The best solution for this is to prepare during your opponent's turns. Think about what offers could come up, who needs what am I interested in, and what options does my hand give me. Here's an example. Your hand consists of 1 brick, 3 wood, 1 sheep, and 2 ore, and you don't have any ports. What are your options? Pause the video to think about it if you want. Almost all players see the road, but what if that would be a waste? Maybe you could trade for wheat to buy a development card or a settlement. So you'd offer the wood for wheat and the ore for wheat later. No takers. You even offer the ore and wood for the wheat. Still no takers. So now what? Pass with 7 cards? No. I took this example because it astonishes me how rarely people make the trade for wood to buy a development card. It's often easier to trade 1-for-1 for wood than for wheat, because wheat holds a lot more value. In many situations, a development card is much better than a road, so it's worth the effort. On screen, you see the offers I'd make until I get what I need. It's no guarantee that I get a deal, but it's much more likely. Opportunities like this arise on multiple turns each game, so make sure to take advantage. You also want to get a grip of the table's trading styles. Who always accept 2-for-1s but never 1-for-1s, who always takes the ore but never the sheep, who is a very loose trader, things like that. So you have to take a look and adapt based on these decisions, because every table is different. In each phase of the game, different type of trades emerge. In the early game, people look to complete settlements and cities. They often give 2 cards for resources they don't produce to complete the set. Most of the trades happen during the early and mid game. Also, in the mid game, people stop trading with the leading player, as the position could get out of hand. If you do decide to trade with the leader, a so-called devil's deal, you have to be sure that this deal will benefit you much more later on than the leading player. In the end game, you don't see a lot of trades happen anymore, unless it is to save the game. An example would be to trade a player in a weaker position the longest road, so the current holder doesn't win the game next turn. In terms of negotiation, you want to offer open deals. So what does open mean? It means that you ask who wants X instead of who has Y. The reason for it is information. For example, if you ask who has ore, people can figure out that you need this ore to complete your city. So they know you have 2 ore and 2 wheat in your hand. It results in that players don't want to make a deal with you, or that you have to pay a lot of resources to get this deal. If you ask who wants brick, people might ask, what do you want for it? You reply with, I don't know, what can you offer? They offer exactly the deal you knew they would offer. You pretend to think about it for a bit, and then you make the deal and build the city. I'll say it again. Catan is an economic game. Klaus Teuber, the creator of Catan, knew this, and that's why he implemented the rubber mechanic to slow down the player who is in the lead. Nowadays, players use this mechanic for all sorts of purposes. However, I don't want to discourage you from getting the additional bonuses the other tactics offer. Making blocks to steal a specific card is a good tactic, but be careful with this, as blocking the leader is more important. It works best if it's still early in the game, the robber can be moved back quickly, and it's their only card. A strategic block is usually a resource they still need to complete a set, and they only have one reliable way of producing it. Ore and wheat are most often the most valuable blocks. But in situations your opponent has 2 cities and nothing else really, the sheep block is often the most effective play, as it stops them from buying development cards and building a settlement. Like I said before, many players are afraid of unplayed development cards, but the top players in the game actually want to test the development cards. So they're more inclined to put a robber on players with unplayed development cards to see if they will play a knight. If you expect a block to last for more than a few turns, it's a good idea to block more often rolled numbers like 8, 6, 9 and 5. Blocking weaker numbers isn't bad, but keep in mind your opponents might not activate a knight to move the robber and save it for a better occasion. We've already discussed solo blocks a little bit, but the effects of it not as much. Both solo blocks and repeating blocks have the potential to trigger opponents. This is bad diplomacy. Sometimes you have to, but be careful. My policy is to do double and triple shared blocks in the early game, but also make sure to not not be too careful, because sometimes repeating solo blocks are needed, so be relentless when you need to be. This is another fun trick, because if you hold a lot of wheat in your hand, or if you produce a lot of it, it's a good idea to block your opponent's wheat sources, so you are the only supplier, and they have to give the trade deals if they want to get wheat to you. Blocking players who attempt the same 2-point bonuses as you is a smart play. However, don't overdo it. Blocking the leader is, in most cases, more important than blocking your competitor. Something else that happens, especially in the early game, is that you see many road races to win a critical spot. Using a rubber on a strategic resource is a good idea if you're involved in one. If others are in one of these road races, keep in mind how your blocks affect their road race. The turn order of players is also key when making rubber decisions. If you block the player who rolls right after you and they have an untested development card, there's a good chance the rubber goes right back on you. Also, when you're competing for the largest army, it's good to have this positioning on your competitor. It's best to go right after your competitor, because if they block you, you can block them right back. But again, keep in mind, blocking the leader in a strategic way is the most important rubber tech. Board awareness is what sets top players apart from the pack. Its most important aspect is card tracking. We'll look at both resource card tracking as well as development card tracking. Let's start with development cards. There's a couple of situations in which you can recognize which development cards your opponents are holding. The most obvious one is that when a key spot is blocked and your opponent doesn't play a knight, they most likely don't have one. An exception is when they save their knight because they know someone else will play a knight shortly after. Some lesser known situations are these. When someone asks for a brick, while they already hold brick but they don't have any wood and no other motive, they likely hold a year of plenty. If players look to complete a settlement with no open spot, they likely have a road building or a year of plenty to go to that spot. And especially watch out for the next one, because if an opponent offers a resource that all players already have, watch out for a dirty mono. The dirty mono is when a player trades away a resource to immediately get it back by using a monopoly on the same turn. But if they hold the card for more than 40 turns, it's likely a victory point or a monopoly in 99% of the situations. However, a surprisingly effective play is to simply ask what development card someone holds, or to insinuate that they're holding the worst possible option. They don't want to be assumed as the biggest threat on the board, so this often leads to them telling straight up what development cards they have. Always keep in mind that they're lying though, because that is definitely an option. You may have noticed how important tracking resource cards are for determining what development cards your opponents have. So let's take a look at that as well. This is a replay of a game I won recently as green. But the first moment I pay attention to tracking resources is when my opponents place down their second settlement. Here we have orange placing on the 9-10 free, so they start with a brick and 2 wood. Blue starts on the 8-4 free, so starting with 2 wood and a sheep. So I keep this in mind. I also look at what they lack, so I try to figure out blue needs brick and wheat essentially, or 2 brick and a wheat to do a road settlement. I try to pay attention extra to the 5 and the 6 if they roll, because that gives blue options to settle somewhere. And with orange, it's actually a bit trickier. I pay more attention to when there is a potential for a wheat trade, because that is the most interesting there. Same thing goes for myself. I place down on the 5-9-2. Don't need to track that, of course. During the game, I pay more attention to the dice that roll than to the resources that get distributed. The main reason for that is tracking the dice rolls is less information, so it makes it easier to memorize. So I keep track. So this first roll, that was a 6, so I remember a 6 was rolled. Next roll is a 7, so I know there's a steal. I stole from blue, so I don't really need to remember anything except that blue lost a sheep. That is interesting because now they need a 4 as well, so this was a really bad sequence for blue. Then we roll a 9 and we roll another 7. So what I remember right now is a 6 and a 9 have rolled and 1 steal has been made, and actually another steal on blue is made here. We don't know what it is, but I know that orange builds a road next. They had that already, so that doesn't give any information really. So that one is still up for debate what card it was, but very good odds. They stole a wood, so I'm not really sure. So I think this was the wrong steal by orange. Also, I don't think blue is in that strong of a position, to be honest. I also pay close attention to which resources my opponents don't produce or produce very little of, because those weaknesses can lead to excellent trade options early on. The two toughest parts about hand tracking are dealing with steals and how to restart when you lost track. For dealing with steals, there is no perfect solution. When someone steals a card, there's hidden information. So I think about the steal possibilities and if one of those cards would give a play right off the bat. So the example is someone holds wood, wheat, sheep and they can steal either a wood or a brick from someone. Then if they place down a road or a settlement, you know it was a brick, otherwise it's a wood. So try to make calculated guesses like that. When you lost track, restart yourself by focusing on the dice rolls and think about how you got each card you're holding yourself. If you received a sheep from rolling a 6, it's a good idea to look at what other resources get distributed when a 6 rolls. Everything that we've covered so far is the German metagame. This is how the game has been played for years. It's essentially basic and fundamental gameplay. This was the metagame until a few years ago, because this is when online Catan leagues became popular, and a lot of innovation came from that. During this time, new tactics were formed that changed how competitive Catan is played. I call this the American metagame, because many players from the United States and Canada are seen as the top players nowadays, and they contributed heavily to these innovations. They include various tactics you don't see in your average house game, and even in-person tournaments have yet to adopt them. So let's dive into the American metagame. So extortion happens when you ask for a trade, and if they don't take it, you do something they don't like. So for example, I'm looking to steal your ore, but if you trade me, I won't put a robber on your hexes. This last part is called a non-block. There's also non-steals, when the robber is put on their hex, but you steal from another player instead. A commonly used phrase is NS for NS, which means non-steal for a non-steal. The second non-steal would be a future non-steal, because you don't know when the next night will be played. Future deals come in various forms. I give you a future ore, means I will trade you the next ore I get for any card of your choice in a 1-for-1 deal. You can also promise future non-blocks or future non-plows. A plow is cutting someone off to a spot. This term has been popularized in the online Catan scene and it has become well known. So a future non-plow means an opponent will leave your spot open. Keep in mind that all future deals are non-binding. There's no way to enforce someone will keep their end of the bargain. In fact, the sentence "I'm doing a non-binding" has become quite popular these days. It's all based on trust, but generally speaking, people will uphold their end of the bargain, especially in the early game. Insurance is when player B holds too many cards and makes a deal with player A. On player A's turn, player B trades a lot of their cards to player A, so player B doesn't 7 out. When we get to player B's turn, they trade the cards back. Player A's reward is usually a free card, a non-block, a future non-plow, or something else. But keep in mind, it's all based on trust. Free card means that two players make two separate deals that result in one of the players receiving a card for free. For example, player A trades 2 sheep to player B in exchange for a brick. Then player B trades 1 sheep to get the brick back. Player B essentially received a free sheep. This type of trading is banned in some tournaments, but not all of them. Bans like these also count for some form of extortion once a 7 has been rolled. However, something that's not banned, but is very strong, is a port service. A port service is when player A has a lot of wheat. On player B's turn, player B says to player A, "Hey, do you want to use my port for an ore with wheat as my reward?" It means that player A trades free wheat for something else from player B. Player B then ports 2 wheat for an ore and then trades the ore to player A for the card labeled as something else. Table presence is very tricky to evaluate, so I'd love to read your thoughts about it in the comments. However, I will tell you what I've seen that works the best. First of all, be active when it matters. You don't need to dominate the conversation, but you should be able to get small rewards of your opponents believing that you're not as dangerous as it seems. Because in Catan, truth is a matter of perspective. So who your opponents believe is in the lead depends on their perspective and what they focus on most. If they lost the last 5 games to a longest road player, they're more inclined to block the player holding the longest road. Nothing to do about that. However, there's 2 things you can do to influence the table. First is making rational arguments, like listing facts. You could say something like, if they build 1 more road, they take the longest road and they'll be at 9 points. The second influence you have is emotional. People who trust their gut and play on instinct listen to this more. Unfortunately, complaining about your setup works well. Keep it non-factual though, like something like, the setup sucks, or the development card. However, keep in mind that this can backfire in 2 ways. First is that people might not like you for being so negative and block you for it. And the second is that people start to think more about your setup and actually can make arguments it is pretty good. Another big downside of repetitive complaining is sustainability. People want to play with you less, but it also leads to you enjoying the game less yourself as well. I've seen that happen. I try to be lighthearted, relaxed, focused, and I joke around quite a bit during Catan. With casual players, I joke about the 7 rolling for example, and with more expert players I try to stay a bit more silent to avoid all the attention. Recently I started table talking more and I find it quite effective. Common sentiment is that table talks works best against weaker opponents. However, I also found that it works against expert players quite well too. However, when I see there's no point in arguing, I don't try to table talk. I'm actually more likely to give a compliment than to say anything about it, because I believe it builds credibility for when I actually table talk. It's effective to table talk when two opponents are negotiating a potential trade. As a quick reminder, trading advances the game of two players. In this situation, that's not you. So come up with arguments why the trade shouldn't happen if there is a potential to blow up this trade. About table presence, I could still say a number of different things, and I'm gonna leave you with the most essential ones. Don't please people if you want to win, so play on instinct and trust your gut in combination with your rational experience. Be relentless when your instincts tell you that you need to be, but be diplomatic when you can. Also, I recommend you to not rush these relentless decisions. Smooth people into it a little bit, like it hurts them more if they don't expect it. These are the top strategies you see when you play ranked on Catan's most popular platform, finalist.io. In fact, I'm so glad they're sponsoring this video because I play on there myself. You can choose to play ranked or casual, the base game or its most popular expansions like Cities and Knights. You can choose to play with friends or strangers whenever you want. Also, I really love its new membership feature called Replays, where you can watch and study your previous games. So click the link in the comment section and play with me on colonist.io. If you want to learn more about what generally speaking works best in Catan, I recommend you watch this video about the 35 vital Catan principles next. Thank you for watching, have a pleasant day.